Hello, my name is Helen Johns. I'm a freelance environmental economist and I am co-author of the IEA publication Happiness, Economics and Public Policy. What we set out to do in this monograph was to present the skeptic's view of happiness economics and more precisely to challenge a particular interpretation of happiness evidence which has become dominant in public debate. It has been said that happiness economics is a new form of science, so let's just think a minute about what that word science means. A true science should be rigorous, it should be logically consistent, it should not set out to prove a particular point of view, it should come up with testable theories and make a detached judgment between them. And these theories should have predictive power. So perhaps we should examine whether this is indeed the case. So just to provide some background context, I would summarise this interpretation, which I'm going to criticise, as follows. When we're talking about happiness evidence, we are working from a premise that measured average happiness of a society is a useful indicator of its overall welfare. And by measured happiness, we mean the results of surveys where people are asked to rate their own happiness according to different categories. For example, in USA surveys, people are asked, taken all things together, how happy would you say you are these days? And people can say they are either 1, not very happy, 2, fairly happy, or 3, very happy. And the most important finding that comes from this is that these surveys seem to show that happiness is either static or changing by very trivial amounts in every society for which we have a long enough time series. And some researchers say this is sufficient to show that in the UK, for example, we're no happier now than we were in the 1950s. And people often contrast this with GDP, which of course has increased significantly since the 1950s. People contrast this growth in GDP with this flat happiness trend, and they say, well, this shows that economic growth does not make a happier society. A second important finding is what appears to be a demonstration of the declining marginal utility of income. Survey results seem to show that more affluent people are indeed happier, but that this happiness increases at a declining rate. And this is often interpreted as showing that the same unit of additional income would increase happiness more if it was given to someone on a lower income than if it was given to someone on a higher income. So to recap, economic growth is not making us happier. We're never satiated. As soon as others have more, we want more. The happiness gained from additional income declines as we get wealthier. And in any case, factors other than income are more important in determining happiness, and we neglect these in favour of pursuing economic growth. So what are the main criticisms of this interpretation? Well, they fall into what you might call empirical criticisms and also consideration of the intrinsic weaknesses of the measure that's used. And I think if we look at the flat happiness time series of a country such as the UK, we're entitled to look at it and ask, well, hang on a minute, if this is a valid measure of welfare, doesn't it show that nothing we've done economically or politically has actually improved people's lives? In fact, isn't it completely futile to try and improve the human lot? And if a physical scientist had an instrument measuring, let's say, auroral activity, and they got back from this a flat line with some random fluctuations, which didn't pick up on known incidents which should have stimulated a response, they would say to themselves, well, that is a very low signal-to-noise ratio, and they would reconsider the sensitivity of their instrument, and they certainly wouldn't draw strong conclusions from it. So we should entertain the alternative hypothesis to the idea that economic growth hasn't made us happier by wondering if perhaps the happiness trend is flat over decades because it's simply a very insensitive measure of welfare. It doesn't respond either to social changes or to policy changes. The increased standard of living is, after all, not the only thing to have changed substantially in the past 30 to 50 years, so why single out economic growth? There are a whole range of social indicators which can rise and fall dramatically without any discernible effect on happiness. There have been big increases in, for example, leisure time, public spending, life expectancy, gender equality. These have similarly had no effect on measured happiness. You might expect the violent crime rate to be a symptom of how contented and at ease with itself a society is. But we observe that in the US, over the period 1971 to 2004, the violent crime rate doubled, then fell back to near its original level. The corresponding change in average national happiness was, of course, nil. Another factor which is clearly temporally unrelated to average national happiness is the incidence of depression. There's a strange paradox here. We are told that one of the reasons we need to measure the happiness of our society is because there has been a dramatic increase in the incidence of depression. But at the same time, we're being told that average happiness has remained constant. It really should strike us as odd that a society's average happiness can remain constant during a supposedly dramatic increase in depression. In fact, if a measure of average happiness doesn't pick up on a dramatic increase in depression, then what on earth is it going to pick up on? Now remember that I mentioned earlier that there appears to be a declining marginal utility of income effect shown by happiness evidence. Basically, people are becoming happier as they get wealthier, but at a declining rate. And people have drawn some very strong policy conclusions from this about redistribution of income. For example, one leading happiness advocate writes, "If money is transferred from a richer person to a poorer person, the poorer person gains more happiness than the rich person loses, so average happiness increases. Thus, a country will have a higher level of average happiness the more equally its income is distributed." So you might think the reverse would also be true, that average happiness would decline if inequality increased. So it would be a good idea to find a country in which income inequality had undergone some kind of abrupt dramatic increase to see if this is what actually happened. And it just so happens that we live in such a country. During the 1980s, income inequality did indeed experience an abrupt dramatic increase. But the effect on average happiness of this was, of course, nil. The fact is, if we'd been sitting here during the early 1980s saying that a more unequal society would make us measurably less happy, we would have been completely wrong. Well, you could object to this by saying, well, all things aren't equal, are they? They might have been happiness gains from, say, economic growth, which have been offset by negative things like increased income inequality. And indeed, a comparable argument has been advanced that there have been happiness gains from economic growth in the UK, but this has been offset by community and family breakdown. Now let's remember that happiness is supposed to be some kind of all-embracing measure of welfare. And I think we should perhaps underline the fact that if an archetypal economist suggested that a society can undergo a big increase in income inequality and a process of serious family breakdown, but that this could be compensated for by economic growth and we'd be just as well off, many people would find this extremely distasteful indeed. Yet exactly the same message can float along, wrapped up in the language of happiness economics, and not be treated as objectionable. This is not the detached inquiry of a rigorous, objective, logically consistent science.
And in the monograph, you mentioned that there are inherent weaknesses in the happiness measures. Could you say what they are, please?
Well, when thinking about the inherent mathematical reasons why the happiness measure may be a very insensitive measure of welfare, we have to remember that when we're asking people to assess their happiness, what we're doing is asking them to put themselves in discrete categories. So, not very happy, fairly happy, or very happy. And this means that if something happens to increase their welfare, but it's not enough to shove them into the next category, then the measurement will not register this change. And once people have placed themselves in the top category, then they cannot, of course, experience any improvement in their welfare according to this measure. So it's not surprising that we wouldn't see any change in the indicator if a lot of people were doing this. And in order to actually register a change in this indicator, what you actually need is for a lot of people to move between categories. So let's say in order to get a 10% increase in typical average happiness scores that we find in the US, you would actually need 22% of the population to move up a discrete category. In fact, it's very difficult to envisage a realistic policy scenario in which 22% of the population would move from being, say, fairly happy to very happy within the space of only a few years. So this goes some way, I think, to explaining why the measure is so insensitive. The other problem is sampling error. If you draw a series of random numbers from a probability distribution which reflects sampling error, then you actually get something which is very similar to the average happiness time series of the US. So this is demonstrating that the indicator has a very low information content and is not actually picking up on changes in society.
Is this just an academic debate between people living in their ivory towers, or does it really matter for policy?
Well, you often hear people saying, if economic growth isn't making people happier, then we should be judging government policies on how happy they will make people, instead of trying to predict their effect on GDP. And there's an implicit idea here that government is failing because it's not paying enough attention to our personal happiness. And there are people arguing for its use in formal government policy appraisal as a result of this. And there are three things, I think, which are wrong with this argument. First of all, there are the inherent weaknesses of happiness as a measure of welfare, which I've already talked about, which means I think it's not up to the job of formal government policy appraisal. Secondly, there's the fact that government already does use a broad range of evidence in policy appraisal, and we should be very clear about that before suggesting prescriptions for our ills, which are based on the premise that increasing GDP overrides everything. And finally, I think if we were looking for a common thread through recent examples of government policy which has not been a success, you'd be very hard-pressed to make the case that it's because these policies are designed with their effect on GDP rather than happiness in mind. A lot of the time it's because of inherent weaknesses in the way that government gathers information to feed back into policy making. So I think this idea that we can improve policy making by measuring happiness is really a red herring. Although the government does actually now have an official measure of happiness which it has adopted. But not only that, there's something intrinsically anti-democratic about wanting to conclusively and scientifically prove that your political viewpoint is the one which will maximise happiness. And we should acknowledge that the political system is there to broker compromises between competing interests. It's not to impose solutions which are universally benign. Ultimately, you don't improve the integrity and transparency of the political system by promoting a single overarching objective with which supposedly all right-thinking opinion should concur.